The sun shone brightly over the suburban streets of clear pines, where every lawn was trimmed to military precision and mailboxes matched in color and height. Derek Walsh, a recently retired Navy SEAL, stood on his driveway with his daughter Mia and wife Rachel, admiring their new home. After years of service and missions around the world, Derek longed for peace, and this neighborhood promised it. Their neighbors were overly friendly, smiling too wide, speaking in uniform tones. The HOA representatives had already dropped off a welcome packet filled with rules: what color curtains were allowed, how often to mow the lawn, even a diagram showing where to place trash bins. Derek chuckled at the obsession with order but didn't question it, not yet. That night, as the family unpacked, a drone buzzed outside their window. Derek quickly closed the blinds. "We're not in a war zone anymore," Rachel reminded him. But something about the controlled atmosphere stirred a familiar tension in his gut. Peace, he knew, could sometimes be the perfect camouflage for control. 2 days later, a white SUV rolled up to the house. Out stepped two men in crisp polo shirts with embroidered HOA logos and black belts that looked suspiciously tactical. They smiled politely and introduced themselves as compliance officers here to follow up on minor landscaping infractions. Derek narrowed his eyes. The flower bed hadn't even been touched yet. The men circled the property, pointing out things that weren't in the HOA guidelines: a bicycle left on the grass, a curtain that wasn't regulation ivory, and toys visible from the street. When Mia ran out to grab her doll, one of the men knelt and asked her name. Derek stepped in immediately. "We're done here," he said firmly, guiding Mia back inside. Rachel tried to dismiss the interaction as harmless, but Derek wasn't convinced. He replayed their speech, their posture, their shoes, military issue. Something wasn't right. He hadn't survived combat zones to ignore danger when it smiled in polo shirts and held clipboards. That evening, Derek reviewed the footage from his door camera. The compliance officers hadn't walked, they'd scanned. Their eyes moved like predators, not like HOA workers. He isolated a frame. One of them wore an earpiece. He called the HOA hotline. The woman who answered said, "We have no record of a visit scheduled today." The next morning, the neighbor across the street, a man who had tried to chat with Derek on move-in day, was gone. His house, previously lively, looked abandoned overnight. A for sale sign had appeared as if conjured. Derek walked over, knocked. No answer. Windows sealed, lights off. Not even a car in the garage. Rachel dismissed his growing concern. People move out all the time. But Derek couldn't shake the feeling that everything here was staged. And now someone had approached his daughter. That was the line. That was when Derek switched back on, not as a husband or homeowner, but as an operator. Mia begged to go to the neighborhood park, a neatly fenced area with rubber turf and a single surveillance camera blinking overhead. Derek sat on a nearby bench, scanning every corner. He noticed two men across the street in a parked vehicle, windows up, pretending to read tablets. They weren't watching the park. They were watching her. As Mia climbed the slide, one of the men casually exited the vehicle and approached the fence. He knelt, holding out a lollipop, and said something Derek couldn't hear. In a second, the SEAL instincts kicked in. Derek was on his feet and between them in 2 strides, gripping the man's wrist until it cracked. The man yelped and stumbled back. A woman nearby screamed, and a second man ran toward them. Derek disarmed him in 2 precise moves and held both men face down until local security arrived. But instead of arresting the strangers, the guards asked Derek to leave. "These men are contractors for a neighborhood study," one officer said coldly. "Please don't interfere again." Back home, Rachel confronted him. "You broke his arm in front of our daughter, Derek." But he was already scanning the printed HOA compliance policy. The logos didn't match the ones on the men's shirts. The wording was vague, corporate legal, with no actual authority cited. And at the bottom, in small print, a strange line caught his eye: data collection authorized by subdivision code A3, black. Derek knew that code. From his time in classified ops, he'd heard of black projects, unsanctioned operations buried under housing policies, telecoms, even zoning laws. The HOA wasn't a homeowners association. It was a cover. The entire neighborhood was part of something else. He packed a bag quietly. "Where are you going?" Rachel asked. "To find out who owns this place," he said. "And to make sure they know they chose the wrong house." As he stepped out, he didn't look back. The lawn was still perfectly trimmed. The neighborhood still eerily quiet. But inside that silence, war was coming. Derek's first stop was the HOA's administrative office. A pristine building with tinted glass and smiling receptionists. No one behind the counter had a name tag. "Can I help you?" a woman asked. Derek smiled politely and said he had a meeting with the manager. She hesitated. That wasn't in the schedule. He'll want to see me, Derek assured. Using a janitor's exit he'd scouted earlier, he slipped down into the lower levels. There he found a surveillance room, dozens of screens showing live footage from inside people's homes. Not just public cameras. Private feeds. Bedrooms, kitchens, nurseries. A man in a suit tried to stop him, but Derek pinned him and took his security badge. On a monitor labeled Profile Notes, Derek saw his name. And Mia's. Notes beside it read, Subject 7, Resistance Index, high. Trigger threshold, tested. Family stability, fracturing. They weren't neighbors. They were test subjects. The neighborhood wasn't just controlled. It was watching, measuring, manipulating. And now he knew. That night, Derek pinned a satellite map of Clear Pines to his garage wall. Using the stolen security badge, he had downloaded the neighborhood's internal layout. Every house was labeled with a code. Some had red circles. Others had green or yellow. His house, Lot 47, was marked in red. So were 6 others on the far edges of the community. He cross-referenced the map with the people he had briefly met since moving in. Red homes belonged to those who had questioned rules, had rebellious children, or didn't attend the weekly compliance briefings. These weren't houses, they were behavioral clusters. Control zones? Derek realized the entire community was a human experiment in obedience and resistance. He took a marker and circled his own home in black. You're being watched, kiddo, he whispered, watching me asleep through the baby monitor. But if they were studying him, they'd made a critical error, exposing themselves. Now he was watching them. Rachel came home from a grocery run visibly shaken. Mrs. Kim next door? Gone. Just like that. Her porch light's still on, stroller outside, but she's not there. Derek already knew. He'd seen the footage of her being escorted out by HOA enforcers under the pretext of noise complaints. Rachel was finally beginning to understand. That evening they received a visitor, a teenage boy named Wyatt from 3 doors down. Whispering through the fence he said, "My dad says they're going to move me to the green zone if I don't stop drawing comics during compliance time." Wyatt showed them a paper slip he found in his mailbox, a behavioral warning issued without any official seal. Derek knew it was accelerating. The test subjects were either adapting or being removed. He handed Wyatt a burner phone. "Stay inside. Keep this with you. If anything happens, call me, not them." Rachel stared at him. "What is this place?" she asked finally. Derek looked out the window. A lab pretending to be a home. At 3 a.m., Derek launched his first counter-operation. Dressed in black, he entered the HOA security hub through an air duct he had marked earlier. Inside, the center was quiet, too quiet. Rows of AI-assisted surveillance terminals lined the walls. He downloaded logs, which included voice simulations, AI-prompted interventions, and false 911 reroutes. Then he found the Child Transfer Protocol folder. It contained detailed profiles of neighborhood children marked as unstable influence or nonconforming. Mia's name was on page 7. Scheduled for relocation via CPS Proxy Unit 42B next week. It wasn't about crime. It was about control. Remove the influence, neutralize the parent. He planted a pulse jammer in the main server and escaped just as lights flickered red. Within seconds, the HOA hub went dark. Emergency teams scrambled. Derek vanished into the trees behind the compound, heart racing. It had begun. The neighborhood would no longer be a silent prison. He was going to burn it from the inside out. The power outage across the HOA network rippled through the neighborhood. Smart locks malfunctioned. Street lights flickered. Security drones went offline. For the first time since moving in, Derek saw the place not as a home, but as a system glitching. And that's exactly what he needed. A chink in the armor. Rachel, rattled by the darkness and their daughter's near abduction, finally confronted him. "You've been keeping things from me. What is this place?" Derek didn't sugarcoat it. He showed her the child transfer file. The simulation data. The surveillance logs from their own home. "They were never going to let us just live here," he said quietly. For the first time, Rachel's fear turned into rage. They were going to take Mia and study how we break. She wasn't a soldier, but she was now something stronger, a mother at war. She grabbed Derek's spare comm headset and loaded the backup drives onto an encrypted stick. She wouldn't be a bystander. Not anymore. Just before dawn, Derek received a secure message through the burner phone. A signal. It was from Nick Rivas, a former SEAL teammate who now worked in cybersecurity for a private firm. "Your name's come up in flagged protocols. You're in a predictive behavior trial. Corporate, military hybrid, top secret. Someone's testing military defiance in civilian settings. Nick traced the operation back to a shell company, Cortex Civic Solutions, with ties to psychological warfare contracts. They're testing how far a soldier-turned-father will go under pressure. Your neighborhood is one of 6 zones. You're the control group with elevated combat background. Derek's blood ran cold. He wasn't just in the experiment, he was the target variable. They want to see when you snap, Nick warned. You need to control the narrative before they do. Derek knew what that meant: documentation, exposure, chaos on his terms. But it also meant one terrible truth: everything he was doing, every step to protect his family, was part of the data they were collecting. The house was quiet when Derek returned. Too quiet. Rachel was in the kitchen, eyes wide, holding Mia's blanket. "She's gone," she whispered. The front door was open. Panic rose like fire in Derek's chest. He checked every room, every drawer, every exit. Nothing. Just a small flyer left on the floor: your non-compliance has consequences. A black van had been spotted leaving the cul-de-sac minutes earlier. Derek accessed the HOA feed, which was now only partially operational after his pulse bomb. He caught a blurry frame of Mia being carried into the van by 2 masked figures in casual clothes. No guns, no shouting, just surgical, rehearsed abduction. Rachel sobbed in the hallway. Derek dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead to the floor. For a brief second, he let the grief pierce him. Then it was gone. Burned away by focus. Precision. Fury. He stood up and looked Rachel in the eye. "I'm going to bring her back. And I'm going to bring down every last one of them." Derek activated a hidden panel in the garage floor, a cache from his SEAL days. Inside were tactical vests, encrypted comms, lockpicks, and a silenced sidearm. This wasn't just a rescue. It was an extraction. And unlike war zones he'd been dropped into, this one had a map he'd built himself: every inch of the neighborhood, every weak point in the HOA perimeter. He sent a coded message to Nick: "They took her. Going in hot. Track license plate 7TX, K20, black van, no plates. Send recon drone silent." While Rachel worked on spreading the word to trusted neighbors and potential allies, Derek prepped for urban infiltration. He knew the simulation was still watching him. Let them. They wanted a data set? He'd give them something they'd never predict. At 2 a.m. he slipped through the service tunnel behind the HOA security building. The van was parked in an underground lot beneath the community center. Nearby, 2 guards smoked and laughed, unaware that death was only steps away. Derek neutralized them with surgical speed. He was inside the lion's den now, and Mia's heartbeat guided every move. Inside the facility, Derek wasn't prepared for what he saw. A vast control room with mirrored glass, lit by pale LED strips. Rows of monitors showed not just Clear Pines, but 5 other neighborhoods across the country. All identical. All silent experiments. Some showed crying children. Others, adults breaking down. It wasn't just a test. It was a model for nationwide control. In one corner of the room was a chair, a child-sized recliner surrounded by biometric sensors. Mia sat there, sleepy but unharmed, watching cartoons. A technician took notes beside her. Derek stormed in like thunder, the technician barely able to raise an alarm before being thrown into the console. Mia ran into her father's arms, whispering, "They said you wouldn't come." Derek looked around. Surveillance footage was uploading to a private server. He planted a virus Nick had prepared, designed to replicate across every connected system. "Download this, bastards," he muttered. As he scooped Mia into his arms, the screens behind him began to flicker: corrupted data, lost control. The experiment was unraveling. Derek rigged charges near the central servers, timing them for delayed detonation. Carrying Mia and guiding Rachel via comms, he navigated back to the tunnel just as alarms echoed through the facility. Guards scrambled. Some were real security, others just data collectors dressed for intimidation. But none were ready for a soldier-turned-father on a mission. Once clear, he gave the order. The explosion didn't level the compound, but it did sever all live feeds, destroy critical servers, and expose the operation to external observers Nick had tipped off. Soon, leaked footage hit the darknet and then major media. HOA behavior study, real families used in psychological warfare trials. The headlines spread like wildfire. Back home, Derek embraced Rachel and Mia as helicopters circled above. Government vehicles rolled into Clear Pines. Faces once compliant now watched in terror, realizing they'd been part of something inhuman. Derek didn't smile. He simply watched as the entire illusion burned and whispered, "You don't control people. Not like this." Clear Pines was declared a national security breach within 24 hours. News vans lined the street, but no one was allowed in or out without government clearance. Rachel and Mia were taken to a secure location while Derek remained behind to debrief federal agents. Not that he trusted them, he was used to classified operations swallowing their own evidence. The Department of Defense denied any connection to Cortex Civic Solutions, but Derek recognized the coded language in their statements. We are reviewing unauthorized experiments conducted by private contractors. It was classic deflection. Yet public pressure was building. Parents from other test zones began coming forward. The experiment had gone too far, and now the world knew it. Derek stood in his garage, watching neighbors quietly evacuate. Most had been complicit through silence. Others had no idea. But a few came to him tearful, shaken, grateful. "You did what we couldn't," one man said. Derek said nothing in return. He hadn't done it for them. He had done it for Mia. And because some wars never end. A week later, Derek received a summons, not from law enforcement, but from a civilian oversight committee. They offered him a seat in a closed tribunal tasked with uncovering the layers of government complicity. "You have a unique perspective," the lead investigator said. "You were inside the simulation and you broke it." Derek hesitated. He didn't want politics. He wanted peace. But he also knew silence was a weapon used by the powerful. If he didn't speak, they'd twist the truth into something clean and convenient. He looked at Mia sleeping in Rachel's arms and nodded. "I'll testify. But not in a room. I want it recorded. I want people to see." His statement shook the country. He exposed the methods, the manipulation, the design to provoke rebellion for data. "They didn't want to stop me. They wanted to watch me break." In homes across the nation, parents watched the footage, realizing they could have been next. The illusion of control was shattered. During tribunal proceedings, more documents surfaced. Derek learned that he wasn't just a random subject. He was chosen. Years ago, after a mission in Eastern Europe, he had reported unauthorized psychological tactics used by Allied contractors on civilian populations. That report was buried, and Derek had been flagged. "They didn't just test you," Nick told him. "They wanted revenge. You embarrassed the wrong people. This whole experiment? It started with you." Derek clenched his fists. It wasn't about Mia. It was about silencing the man who had once spoken the truth. Now it was personal. Derek knew he couldn't go back to normal life. Not yet. Someone had greenlit this operation. Someone at the top. And until that person was exposed, Mia's safety and the safety of millions would never be guaranteed. The mission wasn't over. It had just changed form. Derek's investigation led him to a forgotten paper trail buried in a private contractor archive. With Nick's digital expertise, they unearthed a classified file named Directive Echo 13 dating back 8 years. It was a blueprint, part war game, part social experiment, signed off by multiple high-ranking officials. One name, however, was redacted across all documents. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. 2 former employees of Cortex Civic Solutions who tried to speak to the press vanished within days. Another was found dead in what authorities ruled a domestic accident. Derek recognized the pattern. He'd seen it in war zones. The experiment wasn't just a test of obedience. It was a shield for power. Rachel begged him to stop. "We got Mia back. We're safe. Don't go further." But Derek looked at her with haunted eyes. "We're not safe. Not while they can do this to someone else." He kissed her forehead and walked out. "There were some battles you didn't fight for survival, you fought them so others wouldn't have to." Through encrypted leaks and old military logs, Nick traced the redacted name to a familiar figure, Admiral Spencer Rourke, a man who had once debriefed Derek after a failed SEAL mission abroad. Charismatic, untouchable, now a high-ranking defense advisor overseeing privatized security trials. Rourke had authored the methodology behind Echo 13. Derek confronted him at a private think tank symposium disguised as press. Rourke didn't blink when he saw him. "I thought you'd come," he said, ushering him into a private lounge. The Admiral sipped tea as if they were old friends. "You broke the box. That's what you do. And we learned so much from you." Derek held back the rage. "You used my family." Rourke smiled faintly. "To protect others, sometimes sacrifices must be made. You of all people should understand that." That's when Derek knew Rourke didn't see him as a threat. He saw him as a tool. One he thought was still under control. But Derek had already hit send on the data packet and the world was watching. The leak went live that night. Thousands of internal files. Psychological test results. Approval memos. Even video footage of children monitored without parental consent. Public outrage exploded. Rourke was summoned to a congressional hearing within 48 hours. But Derek knew hearings wouldn't be enough. There had to be real accountability. Whistleblowers emerged from the shadows. Other test neighborhoods were evacuated. Class action lawsuits flooded the federal courts. News anchors struggled to keep up with the cascading revelations. What we believed was home, one reporter said, was, for some, a controlled theater of fear. Derek returned to Clear Pines one last time. The streets were empty now. Playgrounds dismantled. Surveillance towers removed. He stood on his old porch and looked down the street. He didn't feel victory. He felt clarity. They had tried to make him break. Instead, he broke them. In the weeks that followed the leak, Derek's name became both legend and lightning rod. Some hailed him as a hero who exposed a nationwide violation of civil liberty. Others painted him as a rogue operative who endangered national security. News channels split between admiration and condemnation. Derek stayed silent. He watched the debates from a safe house in Colorado, surrounded by court summons, interview requests, and security advisories. Rachel monitored threats online. Extremist groups and compromised contractors still wanted revenge. "They don't just want you quiet," she said. "They want you forgotten." Derek turned off the TV and stared out the window. "I was trained to fight wars," he whispered. "Now I'm at war with the people who trained me." But he wasn't alone. Thousands had rallied to demand justice. Victims, parents, veterans. The simulation had ended, but the fight for truth was far from over. Mia had changed. She didn't speak of the days she was taken, but she drew constantly, houses with eyes, skies filled with cameras. Rachel took her to therapy, and Derek joined every session he could. But healing wasn't just personal. Derek knew there were hundreds of MIAs out there. Through a survivor support initiative Nick helped build, Derek met other families, mothers whose sons were relocated, fathers who had lost custody based on fabricated HOA reports. He listened. He took notes. And he began writing, a journal not of war, but of systemic betrayal and recovery. He titled it The Neighborhood That Watched. And as it took shape, he realized the experiment had failed in its original goal. It hadn't produced obedience. It had ignited resistance. The true legacy of Echo 13 wouldn't be control. It would be awakening. One night, Derek received an unmarked envelope slid under his door. Inside was a flash drive and a single line written in black ink, "There are others." He inserted the drive and found footage from new neighborhoods, fresh faces, different cities. The experiment hadn't died. It had moved. Cortex Civic Solutions had declared bankruptcy, but a new company, Atlas Residential Dynamics, had taken over several properties. The logos were different. The strategy was the same. "They don't stop," Rachel said. "They just evolve." Derek clenched his jaw. "Then we evolve faster." He contacted Nick, reactivated his private network, and called on trusted veterans and former intelligence officers. If governments wouldn't dismantle the machine, he would create a shadow coalition to expose it again and again. Derek didn't seek revenge. He sought prevention. "No one watches our children without consequence," he vowed. Derek's new mission began with data. Through deep web channels and whistleblower leaks, he uncovered that Atlas Residential Dynamics was a shell built on the ashes of Cortex. Same board members. Same architects. But this time, their approach was more surgical: small rural neighborhoods, homes outfitted with smart compliance systems that penalized deviation with escalating consequences. He shared his findings through a new channel called Blacklight, an anonymous forum for former operatives and survivors. Reports poured in: unexplained evictions, missing children, behavioral correction sessions in community centers. The blueprint had evolved, but so had Derek. He wasn't just a target anymore. He was a hunter. Derek created what he called the Echo Protocol, a series of field manuals, tactical counter-surveillance guides, and legal templates for families to use. It wasn't about resistance through violence this time. It was about empowerment. "Let them watch," he said. "We'll watch back. Smarter. Sharper. Stronger." As Blacklight expanded, Derek trained former soldiers and victims to become information agents, men and women who could infiltrate new test zones, record, report, disrupt from within. They didn't carry weapons. They carried truth. In cities across America, families began standing up to their HOAs and demanding transparency. Atlas retaliated. Their legal teams threatened defamation suits. Their enforcers changed uniforms, tactics, and even started recruiting ex-law enforcement to legitimize their presence. But Derek's movement was spreading faster than they could contain. They had underestimated him once. They would not get the chance to do it again. At a covert summit held in a remote Montana compound, Derek spoke to his network for the first time in person. "Veterans, teachers, survivors, journalists. We're not paranoid. We're not broken. We're awake. And we are not alone. Applause erupted, not the kind born from hero worship but the roar of people reclaiming agency. The experiment was collapsing under its own shadow. Back in Clear Pines, the houses stood empty, bought up by private developers trying to erase the past. But one building remained untouched, the HOA command center gutted by Derek's pulse bomb. Now it was scheduled for demolition. Derek returned one last time, standing in the ruins where his daughter had been watched like a lab rat. He found fragments, shattered screens, charred policy folders, a burnt map of test zones. In one corner, scrawled in marker on an old board, were the words Subject 7, Adaptive. Resistant. Dangerous. He smiled. They had labeled him as a problem. And they were right. As the wrecking ball swung and the structure crumbled, Derek stood in silence. Not in triumph, but in resolve. He had torn down more than a building. He had broken the illusion that safety meant silence. The system could rebuild, rename, relaunch, but it would never again do so in the dark. The Watcher had become the witness. In a converted barn-turned-operations hub, Derek sat before a camera. It wasn't a news outlet or government hearing, this was personal. A livestream set to reach every Echo 13 zone, every inbox in his blacklight network. No filters. No edits. Just him. A man who had been used, broken, and rebuilt. I wasn't born to fight my neighbors, he said into the lens. I was trained to protect them. But someone decided to turn that instinct into an experiment to see what would make me snap. They called it data. I call it betrayal. Behind him, screens displayed faces of children taken, families displaced, lives altered by the false promise of perfect neighborhoods. His voice never wavered. This isn't about revenge. It's about memory. About making sure no one forgets what they did in the name of peace. By the time the feed ended, his words had reached millions. In classrooms, town halls, living rooms, the truth finally stood taller than the lie. The signal could no longer be silenced. Time passed. The fire of the scandal dimmed into public memory, but its lessons remained etched in law, activism, and culture. And in Mia. Now 12, she was sharper than ever. Not just in her schoolwork, but in how she watched. Not with fear, but with awareness. She once asked Derek, why do they want to control everyone? Derek knelt beside her. Because they're afraid of people who think for themselves. People like you. She smiled. A mix of innocence and fire. Mia had survived something no child should have, but she had transformed it into wisdom. She spoke at school about privacy, truth, and trust. She wrote essays that made her teachers weep. At night, she still slept with the light on. Not out of fear, but as a symbol. As if to say, you don't get to hide in the dark anymore. Derek watched her grow with pride and pain intertwined. His battle had cost them normalcy, but it had gifted them something deeper, clarity. Years later, a government archive quietly declassified the Echo 13 files. Historians debated its ethics. Politicians distanced themselves. But in a quiet ceremony attended by few, Derek received a civilian medal for extraordinary defense of civil liberties. He didn't wear it. He stored it in a box beside Mia's first drawing of their old house, eyes and all. Blacklight had become an international initiative. Whistleblowers. Security experts. Survivors. They trained communities on digital sovereignty, surveillance countermeasures, and rights advocacy. And at its core, buried deep in its encrypted heart, was the Walsh Protocol, a set of moral guidelines on how to defend without becoming the enemy. On the final page of his memoir, Derek wrote, "They tried to test my limits. What they found instead was a line I would never let them cross. And behind that line stood my daughter. And behind her stood the rest of the world." He closed the journal. A quiet wind passed outside. The world kept moving. But this time with eyes open.